Welcome to episode number 2 of the French Defense Speedrun. In this particular episode, we're going to be focusing on playing against opponents who are in the rating range of 700 to 800. We are going to be looking at positions in games where our opponents make mistakes in the opening phase, how we can punish those mistakes, take advantage of the problems that they're kind of causing to themselves, and we are going to be focusing on exploiting our opponents' inaccuracies and getting good positions. Let's go ahead and jump right into the games that we'll be seeing here. All right, so we have our first game in the French defense that we're going to be playing here in the 700 kind of 7 to 800 rating category of things. The previous video in this series was focusing on the 6 to 700 category of rating. Here we're facing an opponent who is above 700. So e4, e6, knight f3. We're going to continue with d5, going with our French idea. We go e6, we go d5 in pretty much every time they play e4, we're going e6 and d5. I think, as I mentioned in the previous video, there's really only one spot where we might not play d5 on move number 2, and that's if they play the move queen e2 on move number 2. Against this, though, they are developing both the knights. However, at the same time, they have not pushed the pawn up to the d4 square just yet. Usually, if white is going to exchange the pawns, they should put the pawn on d4 themselves. This would lead to a exchange French variation, where white exchanges the pawns in the center. But the fact that they haven't put the pawn on d4 yet does give us the ability to push the pawn up to d4. And generally speaking, this is a pretty good thing to go for. We are advancing in the center, attacking the opponent's knight. The knight does end up going into the middle of the board here. And in this position here, when the knight is in the center like this, we have a couple of different options that are interesting. We could simply just develop our pieces further here. Knight c6 is a perfectly good move. Pawn to c5 is a good looking move. Queen to e7 is also a possibility in a position like this as well, attacking the knight that's pinned. I think in this kind of position, I don't know if we necessarily need to rush to do that just yet. Though I do think at the same time it's perfectly possible for the opponent to make a mistake there. I think I will do it. Let's go for queen e7. We attack the knight that is pinned in this position. It's a bit awkward for white to guard. They do kind of have to play the move queen e2 to protect it. Now we're going to have to do something about the pawn on d4 being attacked. We don't want to play the move pawn to c5 because then white would actually have this interesting idea of knight to d6 check. We would not be able to take with the queen since our queen is pinned. But here I'm just going to go ahead and play the move knight to c6 to guard the d4 pawn. And white faces a little bit of an awkward spot here in terms of protecting, or in terms of developing their king side. The bishop on f1 is blocked in. I will say my bishop is blocked in as well simultaneously, but there's ways we can work around this. Like, we don't necessarily have to castle king side. We can also castle queen side. So I'm not necessarily in as much of a rush as white should be in order to get the king side pieces developed here, because it's harder for him to castle queen side when he has the bishop that is blocked in. It's pretty easy for me to castle queen side because my bishop is not blocked in. So he plays the move c3. He is chipping away at our pawn on d4. A couple of interesting options here as well. Pawn to d3 is a idea in these positions, attacking the queen. If the queen takes the pawn, then the move f5, it takes advantage of the knight on e4 being pinned to the king. We would actually win a piece there. The tricky part, though, is if we play the move d3, white could play the move queen to e3, and then they're still kind of blocking off the pin on the e-file, and we have to be a little bit careful that our pawn on d3 does not become too much of a liability, I would say. So rather than that, I'm actually going to play the move, probably here bishop to g4 is what I'm leaning towards. That's what I'm going to go for. And then probably castle queenside, put the rook on e8, and try to, put a lot of pressure on white's pieces on the e-file sooner rather than later. If they do take this pawn, okay, so they do take the pawn on d4. Here I think white is running into some big problems. I think here I can go ahead and play knight takes d4, attacking the queen. The knight on f3 is pinned, so if white was to take my knight on d4, I would win the queen there. And aside from attacking the queen, I'm also threatening the check on c2, which is a big fork. White does stay on the e-file, which means that they are continuing to block the e-file pin, but it does allow me now to give the check on c2. And now we're simply going to win the queen, and white resigns. We get a pretty quick win here. So, yeah, in this particular game, our opponent goes for the exchange on d5. As I mentioned during the game, usually white should play the move d4 here. If they want to put the knight on c3, they should play d4 first. Then I would go bishop to d6. They might go knight c3 now, pawn to c6. And it's a pretty balanced position. We're usually going to go knight e7, bishop f5, castle. The pawn structure is symmetrical, and so it's a pretty equal position, but I think that there's definitely still room to outplay our opponent depending on how they do things here. The downside for the way that white played in the game, though, by playing the move knight c3, is that they did not put the pawn on d4 just yet. So this gives us the opportunity ourselves to push the pawn up to d4, kick the knight, and continue to put pressure on our opponent's position. So queen e7 is a bit annoying for them to deal with. Knight to c6 develops, and yeah, the big mistake for white was taking this pawn on d4. I think it's a lot safer for them to play a move like pawn d3. They could also maybe move the knight away from e4 and offer the trade of queens, but pawn to d3 would be my move if I was in white shoes here. And then probably if as black, I think I probably would castle queenside, put the rook on e8, and still put a lot of pressure on white's position here. But at least they wouldn't have been, running into this kind of tactic right away, which is what happened in the game. Maybe in hindsight, it might even be better now that I'm looking at it to maybe take the knight on f3 first, now that I'm looking at it a bit more. If the queen takes on f3, then we have knight takes d4 once again, and white is still going to face a uphill battle in terms of protecting everything. And if they take with the pawn, well, then knight takes d4 is still looking very good. So in the game instead, I took on d4 right away. I think I am now kind of realizing what white could have done here that would have actually saved themselves that I did not think about during the game. I think white can actually solve this problem here with this move knight to d6 check, which is actually a very nice defensive idea. Even though this loses the knight, so okay, I'll take with the pawn, he can trade the queens, and now there's no pin going on here, and my knight is free to be captured. And in hindsight, this actually does not look so bad for white. They're equal on material. They're actually doing perfectly fine here, I think. So maybe this was a little bit of a rush thing that I went in for. I should take the knight first and then take on d4. But okay, in the game, my opponent responded incorrectly. And then once I made the fork, the game was over here. So yeah, that's it for this game. And let's get into the next one then. All right, so we've got another game against the move e4. We are going for our French defense. Let's see what option white decides to go for on move number 2 here. So they decide to go for the move e5. This is a relatively common move at the lower rating levels, I would say. In this case, white's pushing the pawn forward. They're kind of trying to sidestep our d5 idea. The way that I recommend playing against this is playing the move c5, because part of white's idea here is they want to play the move d4, and they kind of want to play almost like a advanced French type of setup by pushing the pawn to e5 early in the game, but they've done it before we played the move d5. So it is actually easier for us to attack this pawn in the center. We can play d6, f6. These are different ideas to do at the right time. But I do like starting off with the move pawn to c5 to begin with, because we are making it more difficult for white to play the move d4 and support their pawn on e5. And next we're going to play knight c6, queen c7, maybe maneuver the other knight to g6, and the goal is going to be to eventually win this pawn that's on the e5 square. So our opponent plays the move d4. They're trying to reinforce the pawn, but this was part of the reason we played c5. We wanted to kind of make it more difficult for white to play this move safely. Now I get to trade off the c5 pawn for my opponent's d4 pawn. We have seen in other games in the speedrun, when an opponent allows us to take the pawn on d4 using our c-pawn, especially if they're not able to recapture with a pawn of their own. They're not able to recapture with the c3 pawn, for example. It's usually good to make this trade because now white has one less central pawn compared to ourselves. And again, the e5 pawn is still a bit of a target in the position. So we're going to go ahead and play knight to c6. We attack the queen as well as the pawn. And depending on where the queen goes, there is going to be the possibility for a tactic wherever the queen moves. So we are actually going to be able to win material from this position, regardless of what white plays at this point. If they move, of course, they should move the queen, but wherever they move it, well, okay. In this case, it's maybe not a tactic so much, but we are able to simply take the pawn on e5 for free in this position here. We'll talk about the other options that white could have played, but also kind of see that none of them would have really ended up saving the pawn at the end of the day. So we take the pawn. We now have 2 central pawns to our opponent's 0. We are also simply ahead a pawn, which is good. Now they are developing the bishop and attacking the knight. So I'm going to go ahead and play... let's go for... I'm going to go for the move knight to g6, I believe. I think this is simple enough. Move the knight to safety, attack the bishop, see what white decides to do here. Knight back to c6 would have also been absolutely fine. Okay, he plays knight h3. Not a very good move. Lots of things are good for us here. I think the simplest is probably just to take the bishop on f4. As usual, when you're ahead material, trading pieces is good to do. And then also on top of that, if we're able to trade a knight for a bishop, that means that we are going to be left over with the 2 bishops, and white is only going to have 1 bishop of their own. So the pair of bishops is usually a nice kind of strategic or long-term advantage. On top of us having the extra pawn, that's also another type of advantage that we can work with as the game goes on. So white does recapture. Queen f6 is my first instinct because it attacks the knight as well as the b2 pawn. It is possible for white to guard both of those. He could play the move knight back to d3. And then maybe in that case, my queen on f6 is not the most useful piece in the world. Not the most useful location, at least. So probably I'll just play a bit more, you could say, normally here. I could play d5 to gain space in the center. Maybe I'll do a combination of those things, actually. I'll keep it simple here. I'm just going to play the move d5 right at the start. Grab space in the center, and then develop the pieces around it. I do want to play bishop d6 to attack the knight. That's another idea, but I didn't want to, you can't go bishop d6 here to attack the knight when the queen is covering the d6 square. So pushing the pawn and kind of shielding off that line up first, and then I'll attack the knight, develop, castle. And I don't really need to do anything fancy here. We are just up a pawn with a bishop pair advantage as well. So I just need to develop and castle at this point. No need to do anything crazy. The longer the game goes on, the better it is for me because of these accumulating kind of strategic advantages. A way I've explained it to students of mine in lessons that we've had is that, or at least the way I've heard it, and then explained it to students, is I heard in a Grandmaster lecture one time that this was that accumulating small strategic advantages as the game goes on. This Grandmaster described it as kind of like a squirrel accumulating nuts and kind of building up a hoard of nuts for hibernation or for the winter. And he called it squirrel chess, where you kind of build up these advantages as the game goes on. And I've always kind of liked that outlook on the game. So we have the space advantage, we have the extra pawn advantage, we have the bishop pair advantage. We don't have the bishop pair advantage anymore once we had to block with our bishop blocking the check, but we have these other advantages still. And yeah, it's still a very pleasant position for us as black. I'm going to go bishop d6 to attack the knight. Maybe knight f6 was actually a little bit better as soon as I'm doing this. I do see knight h5 could be a little bit annoying. Okay, they didn't go for it though. In hindsight though, maybe knight to f6 first was a tad bit more precise. But okay, they retreat the knight. I'm going to develop my knight, get castled, get the rook in the game, eventually start playing around the center of the board because that's where I have the extra pawn and the 2 kind of central pawns compared to my opponent's 0. And just looking to continue making further progress as things go on. Probably here, white should be focusing on developing their pieces. I would also say that white should probably work towards the move pawn to c4 at some point. They need to try to fight against my space advantage in the center. If they never end up doing that, then my 2 pawns in the center will get to be pretty solid without much of a fight. Okay, so they played h3. That doesn't really concern me at all. I'm just going to go ahead and castle. And then again, rook c8, pawn to e5, stuff like that. Could do it in either order. Could play e5 first. Could play d4 here. I think I'll go for... I think I'll just go for the e5 option. Let's just grab the space in the center at this point. Maybe push the pawns up the board, continue to kick around white's pieces, and gain more and more space. We'll kind of advance and encroach into their half of the board, and that's going to make it difficult for them to find good places for, or good squares for their remaining pieces here. So e4 is what I'm leaning towards. d4 would have the slight drawback of having all of my pawns in the center blocking my bishop, so I'm kind of preferring to make the move e4 if I have the choice between the two. And I think that's what I'll go for here. I'll go for e4 and attack the knight. He might go knight to b4, but if he does that, I'm pretty happy to continue trading pieces. Bishop takes knight looks perfectly good. Another option could be the move pawn to d4. This is a little bit tricky. If white takes the pawn, there is going to be discovered ideas, discovered attacks towards the opponent's queen. But I think I'm going to just keep it simple here. Let's just trade pieces, double up my opponent's pawns, and then I'll play the move d4, attacking the knight. The pawn on e4 is safe, so the knight's going to have to retreat. And then I will support the pawn. And again, pawns are going very far into the opponent's half of the board. I'm up a pawn in the first place. They also have these double pawns on the b file. The only thing I probably have to be a little bit careful about is my a pawn. I don't want to move the rook away and lose the a7 pawn. So I'll probably play the move a6 at some point just to keep the a pawn safe. But we'll make that move when we have a free moment, depending on what white does here, since they do have to deal with the threat on their knight first. So I don't want to play a6 here because they would take the d4 pawn. So I will first play probably just rook to d8. I could play d3 and continue advancing. It's probably a good move. But I'll just play rook d8 first. I'll leave the pawns kind of there. I'll push at the right time. Play a6, get the other rook in the game. It could also be a case where maybe I can target the pawn on c2 and put some pressure on that. So I'm not really in a rush. I do want to just get the rooks in the game, and once we have all the pieces activated, it's going to be very, very difficult for white to deal with this. But at the right time, I will play the move d3. When you have an extra pawn, okay, in this case, if they play c3, I'm going to go ahead probably and play the move d3. I think that's what I will go for. The slight annoyance here is that the knight can go to the d4 square, and that knight is pretty well placed. But at the same time, I think the fact that I'll have a passed pawn on the d3 square that is protected, I think this is going to be pretty good. Generally speaking, when you're ahead material, again, I've probably said this with plenty of the speedrun games so far, when you're ahead material, of course, you want to trade pieces, but especially if you're ahead, let's say, a pawn, rather than like being up a piece or something like that. If you're ahead of pawn, usually, aside from trading and getting into the endgame, what you also want to do is figure out where your extra pawn is. So is your extra pawn on the king side, the queen side, the center? Where is your what's known as a pawn majority? So where do I have more pawns than my opponent? And then can I use that pawn majority to create a passed pawn? Because when you have a passed pawn, you can potentially push it far enough down the board to make a queen. And that's going to lead to a much, much bigger advantage at that point. So as the game's been going on here, we have the pawn majority in the center of the board, kind of a 2 versus 0 situation. White has no e or d pawn. And so I'm really wanting to play around the center of the board. I don't really want to play on the king side. I don't need to do anything on the queen side. It's all about the center here, where I have the space, I have the extra pawn, and that's part of why we're pushing right down the center of the board here. So white moved the knight to the f4 square. I think I'm going to start off here with a move. I think I'm just going to play a6 to begin with, I think. I could play g5. It almost traps the knight, but white can play the move knight h5 supported by the queen. And again, I don't need to do anything fancy here. I don't need to weaken my king. I don't need to do anything crazy. I just need to play good, solid moves and grow my advantage as the opportunities come. So I'm going to play a6 first, mainly because I just want to get the rook in the game. Maybe I'll play queen f5, maybe knight d5 to trade knights. White can always put the queen on d2 and kind of blockade my pass pawn. But if they're using the queen or the rook to blockade the pawn, then that queen or rook are not going to be very useful in other parts of the board. So I'm just going to continue making small incremental improvement here. Not really a whole lot in terms of calculation or tactics or fancy play. Really just making small little improvements in the position without kind of shooting ourselves in the foot in the process. Okay, so white plays the move c4. This is now a potential target. White has to be a little bit careful about this. And as I said, I think earlier in this game, whenever the opponent, I might have said this in a different game actually, but whenever the opponent makes a move, any move changes something about the position. So in this position, when white pushes the pawn to c4, they are gaining control over d5, but they're also losing control over the b4 pawn. So it actually ends up that the pawn on b4 is now undefended. The knight on f4 is undefended. So there is this idea potentially of queen to d6 to attack both the knight and the pawn. That being said, white could play queen to d2 to protect both. So I don't really know if that does a whole lot for me necessarily. So I think what I'm going to do here, just to keep it simple, I think I'm just going to go rook c8 to attack the c4 pawn. Probably white plays b3 to guard it, I would assume. And then we'll see what to do from there. Okay, they do play b3. They do reinforce the pawn. I'm kind of leaning towards getting the pawn all the way up to d2, because once the pawn's on d2, then the queen has a harder time moving around. That being said, if the pawn's on d2, it's not supported by one of my own pawns, so I have to be a little bit careful about that at the same time. I'm also recognizing, as soon as I just said that c4 undefends the b4 pawn, it's also the case that c4 leaves the pawn on c4 undefended. Maybe queen to c7 would have actually been an even better move in hindsight. I'm kind of just recognizing that. That would have attacked the knight as well as the pawn. I was a bit overly focused on the b4 pawn, but queen c7 would have done a good job as well. But okay, we can't beat ourselves up about missed opportunities. I think I am going to go ahead and play d2. Let's just get the pawn as far up the board as possible. And then we are now threatening queen to d6, attacking the knight and the pawn, because now there's no queen to d2 available for white to defend. I might also try to move the queen up the board and push the e3 pawn and try to open up the king. So, okay, they push the pawn up to b5, but this is not very safe. We do have the queen and the pawn both aiming at this square. So I take the pawn, they take. I'm just going to grab another pawn at this point. My pawn on d2 is defended, so that's not an issue. So we're up 2 pawns now instead of just 1. And we've also got a wide open file for the rook, pressure on the b pawn. I'm going to try to speed up the play here a little bit. Let's go for the move. Let's go queen e5 just to centralize and hit the knight. We'll have to play a little bit quicker here since there's no increment with these games, but we're up 2 pawns. I'm going to probably play the move e3 next to further open up the opponent's king, and that will also give me a good square for the knight to jump forward to. So let's go e3, try to open up the king. If they take, we will take with check. Okay, they play the move f3. Now I can move the knight to d5. This pawn on d2 is now well secured. I'm going to try to play knight c3 to trade off one of these 2 pieces that's blockading. And once the knight's gone, then I can try to play the move pawn to e2 afterwards. So kind of all of these pieces are somewhat frozen, which is a very bad sign for white. This rook move is not safe. It is undefended, and my queen was eyeing the b2 square, so I can take that for free. Try to trade queens next. This time we can go knight c3 since the knight just moved away. And the queen is pretty much stuck. There's nowhere safe to go. You could go to a1, I guess, but we'll trade the queens, promote a pawn. The game is effectively going to end very soon here. Okay. We can take the queen on that square. We can take the knight. We can promote the pawn to a queen. Take this rook. Bring the queen over. And yeah, we will deliver checkmate pretty soon. There's nothing white could do to stop us from playing queen takes g2 with checkmate in this position. Okay, got a little low on time there, but had a very big advantage throughout the whole game. So first things first, in the opening phase, our opponent plays this very early e5 move. I don't think this is all that good. I like this idea of playing c5 afterwards, prevent the opponent from playing an easy d4. Um, it is entirely possible to play other ways in this position for sure. c5 is not the only good move, but the idea is to make it more difficult for white to play d4. And as we saw in the game, they still tried it anyways. We took, hit the queen, and hit the pawn. And as I said during the game, white is already going to lose this pawn. It looks like they can move the queen and defend the pawn. They could go to e4, f4, e3, c3. Those are kind of the squares they could move to guard the pawn. First of all, if they go to c3, we can play the move bishop to b4 and pin the queen. So that's defended by the knight. That would be a huge advantage for us to win material that way. But if they move the queen to any of these other squares, let's say e4, for example, we now have this idea of queen to a5 delivering a check on the king, but also attacking the e5 pawn and making this fork at the same time. And simply put, there's no way for white to guard both. If they block with the bishop or the knight or anything like that, we will just go ahead and take the pawn on e5. Queens get traded, and it's going to be pretty similar to what happened in the game anyways, but, you know, the queens are off the board, and this is very good for black as well. So white could have tried to hold on to the pawn for an extra move, but in the game they retreated. We took the pawn right away. It was also possible to give the check and then take with the queen, but I just decided to take with the knight. And then we just start the game up a pawn, which is very nice. We make further trades, gain space, further trades, hit the knight. Knight h5 here might have been slightly annoying in hindsight, so like I said during the game, maybe knight f6 to stop this idea first would have been a tiny bit better. But anyways, though, as the game went on, castle, and a big thing I think for this game is, aside from us like winning the pawn and starting off the game with a pleasant advantage, whenever you're ahead of pawn, or wherever your advantage is on the board, it's very important that you play the position according to what you have on the board. You don't want to say to yourself, oh, I'd like to attack, so I'm just going to attack. Or, oh, I'm just going to try to trade, and that's all. Like, not think about anything else in the position. So, as I was saying during the game, the big thing here is that we have more space in the center. We have the extra pawn in the center. 2 pawns versus our opponent's 0. I wanted to play around the center of the board. I didn't really do a whole lot on the queen side or the king side or try to go checkmate white or anything like that. I just focused on the middle of the board because that's where my advantage was. And so these pawns got pushed up the board, pieces got traded, pawns got pushed. Eventually the pawn got pushed even further. And then as we saw in the game, this pawn on d3 and eventually getting it to d2 became a huge problem for my opponent. And they eventually, lost the game later on down the road here. Okay, so that's it for this game. I'll see you in the next one. So we've got our next game here. Against e4, we're playing the e6 move. We're going for the French defense. And coincidentally enough, we are playing an opponent from France. So playing the French against a France player. So they go for queen f3. We're going for d5. I think we've also seen queen f3 in one of the earlier games, whether it was from this particular episode or from a previous video. But okay, queen f3, not a fantastic move against our French defense, mainly because there's never going to be any of this bishop c4, queen takes f7 type of stuff. White is playing c4. I mean, maybe he's hoping that after the trade he'll be able to make that threat. Here, there's a couple of options. Playing d4 is possible just to gain some space and make it difficult for the opponent's knight on b1 to develop. Kind of leaning towards that option. Knight f6 also looks perfectly good. Simply developing and protecting the pawn. That also looks like a pretty good move too at the same time. I think I'm going to go for the knight f6 option. I like the idea of trying to accelerate the development. The center of the board is pretty open, so if I can develop my pieces pretty quickly, that's going to be a bit more useful for me compared to my opponent. Also, this queen on f3 is going to be a target that we can attack as the game goes on. That being said, how do we do things here? I could play bishop g4, developing, and kind of not being in a rush to win this pawn back on d5. I do think it is generally pretty tough for white to hold on to this pawn forever. The one thing about bishop g4 that is a little annoying is if white plays the move queen to b3, attacking this pawn on b7, and if we go queen takes d5, there's maybe bishop c4. I guess even there, though, we take the pawn on g2. Yeah, I think we're going to go for this route now that I'm looking at it. So we're going to go for bishop g4, focusing on development, develop the bishop, castle, and try to make use of our lead in development when the opponent is not close to castling their king. Okay, white does go for this queen b3 move. I could just develop and ignore the pawn, quite honestly. I actually kind of like the look of I like the look of that move. Let's see here. I think I might just go for that. I'm really not too concerned about this pawn on b7. Taking on d5 might be the more solid move for sure. But I'm going to play a little bit more aggressively here, a little bit more dynamically. I don't mind losing the pawn. Now I'm going to develop my knight to the d7 square. Queen e7 is actually pretty close to checkmate. The problem is white can block with their bishop or their knight. Probably their bishop they would block on the e-file. I'm not in a rush to do that just yet, though I will be doing that in the near future, I think. So I could throw the check in anyways, though, just to kind of encourage bishop e2. The problem would be, though, then my rook would actually have some difficulty being protected or being saved from the corner. Yeah, I think I'm just going to keep it safe and solid. Well, as safe and solid as you can be being down 2 pawns. But yeah, we have a massive lead in development. All 4 pieces. We can castle. We can hit the queen. We can hit the queen actually a couple of different ways. A check on the e-file for white is going to be very problematic in the near future. And yeah, we're just going to castle, put the rook in the center, and start to attack. Even if white is able to somehow castle safely, we're still going to have a lot of pieces aiming over in the kingside direction here. So very, very difficult position for white. And this is really coming back to one of the kind of main principles of the opening, aside from trying to control the center, develop your pieces, and castle. You also want to make sure you're not bringing your queen out too early and not, mainly it's because you might run into a situation like this where you have to develop it and move it around a ton of times, and not really a great situation. The queen moved, 1, 2, 3 times. It's going to have to move a 4th time at some point once I attack it again. So here I'm just going to castle. Let's get away from the pin. Rook to b8 was also available, but the queen would have moved away. My main idea now, though, is to give this check on the e-file and try to attack white from here. That being said, now that the bishop is on b5, and now that my knight's also not pinned, there is actually an even more straightforward and better way of doing things. I don't even think I need to give a check necessarily. So maybe if you want to pause the video and see if you can figure out the best way for black to play, there is a way we can kind of take advantage of this queen who has moved a lot of times in the opening. So what we can do in this position is play the move knight to c5, hitting the queen. We also take away the a6 square. So the only safe square is for the queen to move to c6. And once the queen moves to the c6 square, assuming that's played, then we can drop the bishop back to the d7 square, protected by the knights. And now the queen is simply trapped in this position here. This wasn't available before I castled. Note that I could not have played the move knight c5 right here when my king was on e8 because my knight was pinned. I had to castle first, and then this knight c5 idea was available. So they take the rook on a8. I'm going to just go ahead and recapture. And yeah, we are ahead a queen for a rook. White does have a couple of pawns, but the queen for the rook advantage is pretty nice here. I could throw in the move knight d3 check first. I might actually just kind of throw this move in first before white gets to somehow stop it or before white gets to somehow castle. Taking back on d7 right away would have also been totally fine. I could take the bishop and continue trading pieces, but the bishop is not even active or developed yet. I'm going to come back here and give another check, then take the bishop on d7, and we're going to look to attack white's king, who is stuck in the center. If the king he's moving all the way up to e3, I may not even necessarily be in a rush to take this bishop. Maybe rook e8 check or knight takes d5 check or something like that might be available. But let's see. Is there anything better than just taking the bishop? I'm sure there probably is, but think I'll just take the bishop. Now I can check on the e-file without the bishop ever taking, and the king is most likely going to be mated in the very near future here. So we give a check with the rook. Wherever the king goes, we will take the pawn on d5 with check afterwards. So let's do that. Check the king. And here, I think we have checkmate in probably 2 moves. I think we can do it a ton of different ways. I'll take the pawn. The king will move over. And then we'll have g5 checkmate. Or bishop e7 checkmate, or things like that. Okay, our opponent abandons or resigns the game. One of the two, but it's a lost position at this point. So anyways, though, in the opening phase, we play the French defense, and our opponent plays queen f3. I do think kind of under the 800 rating level, this is already at least the second time we've seen this. Maybe the third. I actually don't remember from all the games we've played so far. But yeah, against this queen f3 move, we're simply playing d5. And I think a lot of the times when somebody goes for an early queen f3, I think they're generally at this rating level angling for some kind of scholar's mate or 4-move checkmate type of thing. But the nice thing about the French defense is that's not possible. Against the French defense, we put the pawn on e6 and then d5. There is no bishop coming to c4. There is no attack on the f7 pawn, at least not with the second piece. And black is already in a little bit of a better shape here because we can attack this queen as the game goes on. And that's exactly what we did. They tried to hit the pawn in the center. I think once again, they're just hoping we trade and then somehow just like, they're hoping for something like this, of course, which we would definitely not let happen. I decided to go for knight f6, and instead of taking the pawn back, I really like to, this idea of kind of like accelerating our development, making threats. I'm not too focused on the pawn in the center. I'm more focused on getting as many pieces in the game as possible and then trying to attack the opponent's king, who is stuck in the center of the board. And this is mainly possible because white is moving their queen a bunch of times in the game. And if they're moving the queen a bunch of times, that means that they're not getting closer to castling, they're not developing more pieces, and the queen is just moving around a ton of times. So the queen moved over, we developed, castled, and it ends up that because the queen did so much jumping around and jumped into our half of the board, it ends up that they don't really have a parachute, you could say. There's no way for the queen to make it out safely, and we were able to trap the queen with knight c5, bishop d7. The queen is lost, cannot go to the a6 square because the knight covers that. b7 is still covered. So they took the rook. And then here, of course, I could recapture on d7. Nothing wrong with that whatsoever, but I decided to throw in some checks first. And eventually we got the checkmate, or we're going to get the checkmate pretty soon. Okay, so that's it for this game. Hopefully you've enjoyed these couple of games in the 700 to 800 rating range. The next video for the French defense series here will feature games in the 800 and 900 rating range. So I'll see you in that video. And then we will go through some more games as we continue going up the rating ladder. See you in the next one.